Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's webinar, Southeast Asia's Climate Future in the Post-COP29 and Trump 2.0 era, organized by the Climate Change in Southeast Asia program at ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute. I'm Seah, your MC for today. Before we begin, I would like to go over a few housekeeping matters. Firstly, please note that this webinar is not under the Chatham House rule, and the recording will be uploaded to YouTube after the event. If you encounter any technical issues, please use the chat function to reach out to our technical support team. Secondly, to ask questions to the speakers, please use the Q&A function, stating your name and affiliation together with your question, as well as which speaker you would like to pose your question to. And you can send in your question at any time. Lastly, if you would like to stay informed on our climate change program's activities, do sign up for updates at the URL, which I will be posting in the chat box in a few moments. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our moderator for the session. Dr. Christopher Len is the visiting senior fellow at the Climate Change in Southeast Asia program here at ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute. And I will now invite him to begin the webinar. Dr. Len, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christopher Len. I'm currently a visiting senior fellow under the Climate Change in Southeast Asia program at the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute. I will be the moderator for this session. Two major events of international significance occurred a month ago in November. The first is the US elections, which Donald Trump won. We also saw a Republican sweep of them gaining control of the Senate and the House of Representatives. The second is COP29, which was held in Baku, Azerbaijan. Unfortunately, many leaders stayed away. A new agreement to finance developing countries from the previous goal of $100 billion annually to $300 billion annually by 2035 was agreed on, although critics have said this sum is insufficient. COP29 also reached agreement on carbon markets under Article 6 on how carbon markets will operate under the Paris Agreement. So, what are the implications of these developments for Southeast Asia? We have a very timely event addressing this question. I'm very glad to moderate today's webinar titled Southeast Asia's Climate Future in the Post-COP29 and Trump 2.0 era. We have three experts with us online. The first speaker is Professor Angel Hsu. She's Associate Professor at the Public Policy and the Environment, Ecology and Energy Program at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She's also Director of the Data-Driven Enviro Lab, which is based in the university. She's currently based at our institute as the Wang Gen Wu Visiting Fellow. The second speaker we have is Professor Hu Bin, who is Associate Research Professor at the Institute of Climate Change and Sustainable Development at Tsinghua University. And we have a third speaker, and that's Ms. Sharon Seah, Senior Fellow and Coordinator of the Climate Change in Southeast Asia program at the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute. Each speaker will be given 15 to 20 minutes for their presentation, and that will take us roughly till about 4 p.m. After that, we will have a Q&A session. So today we have a tight schedule, and I will quickly move aside as moderator. I would like to invite the first speaker, Professor Angel Hsu, to give her presentation. Professor Hsu, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Christopher, and thank you so much to ISEAS for hosting this really timely conversation. And as Chris mentioned, I'm actually here in Singapore at ISEAS, and I'm investigating the nexus of US, China, and Southeast Asia and how we move forward and potentially cooperate and collaborate together on climate change. And I think there's a lot of unknowns with the recent US election and also with the COP29. So I'm going to share my screen and hopefully everything will work well. And so I titled this The US Perspective, but I just want to caveat, I'm not speaking from or for the entire United States. I think there's a lot of unknowns as we move into the inauguration in late January, although I think we have somewhat of a sense of what might happen just based on the 2016 to 2020 Trump 1.0 era. But I wanted to share some thoughts in terms of where we stand currently with respect to U.S. climate policy and what prospects we might have to continue some of that climate action going, even in a Trump 2.0 era. So just as a refresher, let's talk about the single most important climate policy in the United States, which is the Inflation Reduction Act. And that also was in parallel to the infrastructure bill, which set a target to reduce, well, it didn't exactly set a target, but essentially set a target for financing. And with that financing, particularly in the form of tax credits and incentives to galvanize clean energy, renewables, and adoption of clean energy technologies, would lead the U.S. to reduce emissions 40% by 2030. And so that's an important number because, of course, when President Biden became president and took the helm in 2021 and reestablished the United States in the UNFCCC and assigned the United States, decided to bring the U.S. back to sign the Paris Agreement. He set a target to reduce emissions by around 50 to 52% by 2030. And so with this target, that could increase the share of renewables and nuclear to around 60 to 81%. And I think most importantly, it would also create 9 million clean energy jobs. And the focus would be on clean technology and renewables, including offshore wind, batteries, and solar development. And so what's quite interesting is that the United States, after many, many years and many rounds of trying to develop a comprehensive national climate change policy, I was actually living in Washington, D.C. in 2007 when the Waxman-Markey bill was being negotiated in the House, and that would have set an absolute cap on greenhouse gas emissions. It would have introduced emissions trading in the United States. That did not pass the Senate. And so when President Obama went to the 2009 Copenhagen climate talks, he really didn't have anything by way of a domestic climate policy to bring to the table. And so then that led us into the 2015 Paris climate negotiations, where that ushered in this bottom-up process for countries to decide themselves what they could actually put forth on climate change mitigation, adaptation, and financing. And so that's why the IRA is really critical, because it's a bipartisan bill that established support for clean energy and renewable technology, and really was based on both sides coming together, and it represents the single most important climate policy in the United States. And just by way of tackling fossil fuel energy sources could also prevent around 3,900 premature deaths as a result of cleaning up the air and reducing air pollution, which is the fifth leading environmental cause of death and the leading environmental cause of death worldwide. And so getting more specifically into what exactly is included in the Inflation Reduction Act and what incentives actually help to reduce emissions, you can see, and the numbers are a little bit unclear. This figure that I found here has 391 billion, but then other statements say that the amount of financing is around 369 or 370 billion to emissions cutting measures. But you can see the breakdown on the right-hand side of where this money would be going, and it's predominantly in the form of tax credits, direct payment grants. And what's also interesting is that you get funding also going to support traditionally disadvantaged communities that have been historically burdened by the effects of poor air quality and climate change impacts. And so you can see that a large chunk of the money is going to these clean electricity tax credits, also to air pollution reduction and transportation and infrastructure build out, clean energy and vehicle tax credits to incentivize consumers to adopt clean EVs instead of traditional internal combustion cars. And so when we take all of those different efforts and all of the various technology adoptions and shifts and increases in energy efficiency, reducing fossil fuels in the transportation sector and also electricity sector, there has been modelers that have developed these kinds of analyses that show that just the Inflation Reduction Act could reduce emissions by 42% in 2030. And so that's quite positive. It obviously doesn't get us all the way to the net zero pathway that President Biden had established once he took the helm at the head of the US administration, but still that gets a long way to this 50 to 52% reduction that he had committed to. And then that's obviously helpful in helping the US actually transition to a net zero CO2 economy by 2050. But even still, despite all this fanfare and all of the excitement around the IRA and the fact that it got through Congress, there have been analyses, including from the Climate Action Tracker, that show that these efforts are still largely insufficient. And that's because, again, it only gets us to around 42% of that 50 to 52% target that is really needed in order to keep the US on track to a net zero CO2 scenario in 2050 by mid-century. And so still insufficient. And also the Biden administration has increased exploration of oil and gas during his tenure. And so that also is leading into the wrong direction if we're talking about phasing out fossil fuels, particularly in the electricity and the transportation sectors, which are the two major sources of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. And so the major question for me as we talk about the achievements under the Biden administration is what pieces might still be able to be sustained in Trump 2.0 and after COP29, and what areas might we expect some rollbacks in the Inflation Reduction Act and a lot of this really incredible investment that's been flowing towards the clean energy and technology sectors. So I think those are two questions I would love to discuss in the course of this panel. But in terms of what might actually last and stay, I'd like to talk about the role of subnational networks and subnational governments, including US states and cities that have been very active on climate change over the last 10 years or so, and also the role of the private sector, because I think that these are pieces that were active during Trump 1.0 and continue to stay active even under the Biden administration and help to support the Inflation Reduction Act rollout and implementation. And I expect will continue to be the stalwart, the base of climate action under a Trump 2.0 presidency. And so this is a map from our database where we're tracking all of these subnational and private sector actors. And so you can see in the United States, we have several of these coalitions. The United States Climate Alliance, which is focused on US states. It has more than half of US states that are actively participating and have committed to their own climate actions. You have the Climate Mayors Coalition, which has hundreds of US mayors that have also pledged climate actions. And then the America is All In movement, which actually started in 2016 once Trump was elected. And so when Trump was elected, and he even campaigned on withdrawing the United States from the Paris Agreement, which again, on this round, he also campaigned to pull the US out of the Paris Agreement. And immediately there was this coalition. You can see some of the statistics, over 1,700 companies, 243 mayors, 300 universities, 9 governors that stepped up to the plate and said, wait a second, even though the national government may be out of the Paris Agreement, we are still in. And so they committed to continue climate action and develop their own climate action plans to ensure that the United States would not be lacking any type of climate action. And so to date, you can see this is from the United Nations Framework Convention. They have a website that's called the NASCA platform, the Non-State Actor Zone for Climate Action. It's climateaction.unfccc.int. And you can see that in the United States, there are more than 3,000 of these actors that are still active, more than 2,000 companies, 265 investors, over 1,000 nonprofit civil society organizations, 20 regions, and 300 cities that are recorded on this platform that have pledged climate change activities, including their own emissions reduction targets, and are implementing their plans to achieve them. So I think this piece we would expect to continue under a Trump 2.0 presidency. Now, you might ask, well, is this meaningful? Can this even make up for a retreat of and rollback of environment and climate actions on the part of the US national government? And of course, we saw during Trump 1.0 that the Trump administration withdrew and rolled back around 125 pieces of environment and climate related legislation. And so this is something that my research group, along with a consortium of other research institutes, including New Climate Institute, which develops that climate action tracker. We have other universities, including Oxford and Utrecht University, that have worked with us since 2016 to quantify what might be the additional impact of these subnational and non-state climate actors to global climate mitigation. Can they help to fill in some of that leadership void when you have national rollback from the US or Brazil or from other countries? and how can this type of action help to ensure that we still have momentum towards our global climate goals? And so you can see the various reports. Actually, the first report we launched in 2018 when then California Governor Jerry Brown hosted the first ever Global Climate Action Summit to bring attention and to convene non-state and subnational actors together. So the first report was launched there. And then you can see since then we've developed 5 of these reports to evaluate the global state of climate action from cities, regions, and businesses. When we first did this analysis, you can actually see this is from our 2019 report. You can see that when we take a look, and so I don't know if you can see my cursor. I don't actually know where my cursor, oh, there it is. So you can see current national policies here in blue, and does not really get us anywhere on track to the US's initial NDC. And this is taking into consideration rollbacks from the Trump 1.0 administration. But then this orange bar here is just an aggregate of current national policies, but then the individual actors' commitments. So when you have those states, those companies, the cities pledging their own voluntary actions that often exceed the ambition of national policies, that can actually make up half of the original US's NDC here in this dotted orange line. And then on the right, you can see that a lot of that action is actually coming from states, from regional governments that are pledging their own emission reduction targets. Increasingly, these are net zero targets. So you can see in this map in gray, all of the US states that have pledged their own emission reduction targets. Now, half of US states have also pledged their own decarbonization goals. And at least 6 of them have set timeframes and target years that are more ambitious than the Biden administration's 2050 decarbonization goal. So that's really encouraging. And we can tell from this particular map and from these efforts that even in a Trump 2.0 scenario, we can hope that these states like California and New York State and Maine and Illinois, a lot of these states will continue to implement their climate efforts, even despite national rollbacks and U.S. withdrawal again from the Paris Agreement. We recently did an analysis that was published in this peer-reviewed academic journal, One Earth. If you'd like a copy, please email me. And unfortunately, despite all of these subnational efforts, we can see from this particular bar that it actually really only amounts to less than half of the original, this is the green star, the maximum that we could hope for if the IRA was implemented and all other measures were implemented and the US were actually to achieve that 50 to 52% reduction, what that might look like in 2030. And so here you can tell that even the state efforts and the city efforts aggregated together don't really get us to where we need to be in order to reach the US's goal. And then you can see the 1.5 degrees scenario would be down here. So still woefully short. And I think that just emphasizes the incredible importance of having even more ambitious subnational action, having more states join, more cities, more companies. And I think we might see that. I think that the pendulum and the momentum, particularly from the IRA, the money has been flowing into the states, it's been flowing to companies and various project developers. I think they're going to be very reluctant to give up that money and that financing or those favorable tax credits. And so I think hopefully we can see that those particular efforts are locked into this next 4-year period, and we'll see more momentum building and having more states and cities join. But of course, they could face a lot of challenges from the Trump administration itself. And I think that's what we have seen during Trump 1.0, particularly with California developing its own vehicle efficiency standards, and the Trump administration challenging a lot of those in the Supreme Court. And of course, with a lot more regulatory rollback on these vehicle emission standards, on power plant standards, appliance efficiency standards, I think that could also be pretty detrimental, make it even more difficult for states to set their own policies and regulations along these lines as well, particularly because the Trump administration, as I just mentioned, the example of California, has been challenging a lot of these state level climate regulations in the courts. And so a lot of states might be reluctant. And there's also been a lot of conversation about the Trump administration potentially suing companies that decide to join in these networks and these coalitions that I showed you in the map, and for antitrust violation. And so as outrageous and outlandish as it may sound. Simply having a company join a net zero alliance or a net zero emissions reduction network or initiative could be seen as as an antitrust violation, a cause for accusations of monopolistic corporate behavior. And so a lot of companies now risk or they fear that particular risk, that if they actually declare a net zero target and join in one of these initiatives, that they could then be sued for antitrust. And then I think that the biggest elephant in the room, and I'm really looking forward to Professor Hu's comments on this particular piece, is on tariffs, because Trump has already announced another round of tariffs, particularly on China, increasing those to as much as 60%, but then also potentially clamping down on other tariffs that could frankly raise the cost of clean energy in the United States. And so the Biden administration had put a pause on some of these tariffs, particularly for goods coming from Southeast Asia. And the major question will be whether or not those pauses on Southeast Asian tariffs would be continued, or if Trump will lift those and continue to and raise the tariffs on goods, clean energy technologies that are being manufactured or assembled in Southeast Asia. So one of my first pieces as part of my Wang Gungwu Fellowship was to develop a piece on Fulcrum talking about VinFast, which is a Vietnamese EV company that has already established plans to develop a EV assembly and manufacturing facility in the United States, actually in North Carolina, about 20 minutes from where I live. And so there will be a major question in terms of whether or not these types of ventures and partnerships with Southeast Asian companies will be able to happen under a Trump 2.0. So I think that's a major question. But then that's kind of the negative pieces, but I think we have some reasons for optimism. So I mentioned the IRA, and 60% of the funding to projects on clean energy, on renewables, has actually gone to Republican districts. And so around 70%, or there's been some debate in terms of how much money has actually been allocated through the IRA, but I've seen as high as 70%. And so I think it's going to be really difficult. We talk about endowment bias. I think it's going to be really tricky if the Trump administration wants to claw back some of that funding. I think it's going to be really difficult because most of the funding is actually going to red states, to Republican districts. And so I think that would probably be unlikely, hopefully. But then there's a major question in terms of the remaining IRA funds, whether or not the Republicans will be keen to try to claw those back. And then also some of the tax credits, particularly for EVs, we could see some reversal and of those pieces of legislation. And then also there could be increases in content requirements that would make it trickier for everyday consumers to actually afford some of these clean technologies, particularly on EVs. In terms of non-state and subnational action, I think that we're going to see a resurgence and perhaps a multiplication effect of We Are Still In 2.0. At least I'm very optimistic, and I'm hoping that will be the case. Particularly, I'm sure Professor Hu will speak to this, but at the COP29 negotiations, we saw that particularly between the US and China, this was one area that didn't seem to cool off and where there still seemed to be a lot of enthusiasm. Myself, I've attended 2 US-China subnational climate action summits just in this last year alone. So I feel that this is one area where the US and China, at least at a subnational level, are eager to continue the collaboration. And then also there is a lot of existing bipartisan support for some of these technologies and innovations on carbon capture, critical minerals, and industrial decarbonization that will frankly benefit the United States and help to bolster some of these areas within the United States to make it less dependent on larger supply chains and global supply chains for a lot of these technologies. So I think there's still a lot of momentum that we can point to and where there's bipartisan support on both sides, and hopefully we won't see a retreat. And then I think the last elephant in the room, and this is my last slide, is whether or not in the next few weeks we might see the Biden administration come out with a third nationally determined contribution on the part of the United States. So as a reminder and refresher to folks who may not be familiar with all the UNFCCC parlance, an NDC or nationally determined contribution is a country's submission to the Paris Agreement that outlines what actions it's going to take on climate mitigation, adaptation, and financing. And already there have been 2 rounds of this, and there's a February 2025 deadline by which national governments are supposed to submit their enhanced ambition NDCs based on the most recent and the first global stocktake that showed all of the gaps and the necessary action in these areas. So far, only 3 countries, the UK, the UAE, and Brazil, have actually submitted their enhanced ambition NDC 3.0. And there's this great analysis that I've outlined here from the University of Maryland, the Center for Global Sustainability, that has actually taken a look at all of the existing policies on the books through the IRA, the infrastructure bills, and seeing where are there opportunities for enhanced ambition, and what could that get the United States by way of this NDC 3.0. And what they found is that the US could actually commit to a 65% reduction in 2035, which would be huge because it would get the United States well on track to their net zero target by mid-century and bring the US back in line with scientific benchmarks for 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature goal. So I think that's quite exciting. And you can see a lot of those additional efforts come in the electricity and the transport sectors, which are the highest emitting sectors in the United States. So they found a lot more fruit could be picked in these 2 sectors that would allow the United States to commit to an enhanced ambition NDC. And what I also found striking about this analysis is non-federal action. So these non-state subnational actors could reduce emissions 48 to 60% even without federal support. So again, pointing to the subnational and non-state actors to sustain climate action on a subnational scale and continue to deliver emissions reductions even without the leadership of the United States. So I think that's really positive, and I think there's still time. I think there's time for the United States to submit and announce this NDC 3.0, even if the Trump administration might then reverse it later. So thank you so much, and I look forward to my co-panelists' interventions and to have a very rich exchange. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Hsu. I think my takeaway from what you have said is that we also need to take into account the importance of subnational and non-state actors in driving US climate agenda, and that includes engagement in the international space. Second, there's still a degree of uncertainty between Trump 2.0 and how it will affect the US climate agenda in the coming year. So thank you very much for your presentation. And I will now move on to Professor Hu Bin. Professor Hu Bin, please go ahead. You have up to 20 minutes.
Okay. Thanks, Christopher. And thank you for having me here, and thank you for Professor Angel's invitation. Okay, for today's talk, actually, sorry, I don't prepare the PPT, so I just talk. I will have my talk from 3 aspects. The first, I will talk about briefly about the COP29. The second part, I will talk about the China-US climate cooperations under Trump 2.0. And the third part, so what's that impact on the China's invest in Southeast Asia countries? So first, for the COP29, actually, I stayed there for the whole 2 weeks. And I think for the last few years, now each party actually left with no satisfaction, but with equal unsatisfaction. This is different from the previous years, like each party will reach agreement, but with equal satisfaction. So now actually with equal unsatisfaction. So I think that's the situations facing the world today. Also for China, I think because for this year, as we know, Trump is already re-elected. So I think China thinks that this will be the last chance for the next 4 years to reach agreement. So although we think the NCQG is not enough, but we think it's still good and give a positive signals for the world. At least we still have an agreement. So we want to still work together, and hopefully we can fix something out in the COP30 in Brazil. Also, from the EU side, I think when we talk to the EU side delegates, I think they are also not very excited about this COP because due to the relations between France and Azerbaijan. So actually the French government only sent very small delegates to the Azerbaijan this time. So also due to the global financial, the economic situation, actually the economic growth is not very good for all the countries. So that's why each country don't have very high expectations for the outcomes of COP29. So I think anyway, we have agreement, which is better than nothing. So that's for the COP29. I think the second part is U.S.-China climate cooperations. Also, I'm now doing research with my colleague, with Professor, I think, Deborah from Villanova University. Actually, we also interviewed Professor Angel just a few days ago. In the COP29, we actually interviewed so many diplomats from US, also from other different countries. We also interviewed business leaders, NGOs, and scholars. Actually, from our point of view, we are not that optimistic about the future, at least in the next 4 years, about the future China-US climate cooperations. Because Angel just mentioned lots of subnational cooperations between China and the United States. But from our interviews, some people told me, like, even for California and Guangdong, I think they already signed the subnational agreements like in 2020, but now almost everything is stopped. So that's the big, very, very sad news. But for the business levels, I think some China business just still seeking the opportunities in California. For example, one battery charging companies, the CEO told me he did very good in California, but that's the only state he can operate the business in US. But for other states, he finds it's very difficult. So probably that's the situation between US and China now. Also from the US side, I think although the companies in US want to seek more opportunities in China, but they are now afraid to do so because they are very worried about the national securities, and also the China's dominance in the renewable supply chains. So that's the two main reasons why the US government are worried about China's cooperations with US in the renewables. Also, so then we ask, what can we still cooperate between US and China in the next 4 years? I think somebody just listed a few areas. For example, circular economy, food waste recycling, and the decarbonization buildings, and probably CCUS. That's the only one technical areas that the both countries can work together now, because this is also benefit for the US oil industries. That's why probably US think it's still worth to cooperate with China on these directions. Also from Tsinghua side, because now we have cooperations with Harvard universities on the CCUS technology. Each side will present the newest development of CCUS technologies on both countries. So that's the one area we are still cooperating with US universities. So I think this CCUS may be still one potential we can still continue to work on the next few years. And but for other technology, I think it's really hard. And the last, also another point I want to mention here is the NGOs, I think, still have a chance. But although the NGOs feel now it is still also they feel pressures by, for example, from US side, they feel pressures from the government to go to China to have a conference now. So that's why now they want to choose the third parties. For example, they want to choose like in Singapore, or also probably choose Hong Kong as a balance in place for holding kind of a conference. So that's the way they want to do that. Another point is like the NGOs think it's still possible for the NGOs to work on the third countries. I think that's the way probably each two countries can work. Like except NGOs, for other business, probably we can still work together on the third parties. That's the one I want to talk about in the third part, like how China and the US can work together in, for example, in Southeast Asia countries. Another point is for the scholars exchange, I think now still very tight, because now for the US, I think they still have some like prohibitions for the scholars to go to China now. But from the China side, I think China is eager actually to want to exchange more ideas with US scholars. So from this point, actually, in the last 1 year, I met more than 10 universities from US side. I think for this channel, it's still possible for both to work together. Because now the good thing is, after COVID, the online meetings becomes very important. So although now it's very difficult for us to travel to US, also the same for US scholars to travel to China due to the limited air plans, but we can still talk online. I think that's the one ways we can still cooperate with each other to exchange ideas, except the Harvard University I just mentioned about. We also now have cooperations with Princeton universities. But now the problem is the data issues, because in 2023, China also have a law for the espionage of the data. So data now is a very sensitive issues for both countries. So now the working mechanism between Tsinghua and, like, for example, with Princeton universities is they give us their modelings, and I will use our data from China to use in the models and give the results back to the Princeton universities. So that's now the way we are working together. I know it's not a very good way, but at least we can still working together by, like, we can just use each outside data by ourselves. But I think the data issue probably will be a very big obstacles for both countries to work deeply in the future years. So for the third part, like, so what's that impact will be on Southeast Asia? The first point of view, I think China's role in meeting Southeast Asia's clean energy will likely to grow, because Trump plans to trim the scope of the IRAs, also scaling back on global solar and wind initiatives to focus on US-centric industries. So I think probably that's the opportunity for China to expand its renewables on the Southeast Asia countries. Because according to the Lowy Institute, China now is the largest single source of international renewable finance for the Southeast regions. Also for the EVs, I think China automakers have more than 70% of Southeast Asia EV market. But for the US side, I think it's less than around 4%. So that's a big difference. So with Trump re-elected, I think China probably will rise in the EV sectors too. For example, I can also give some other numbers. In 2023, China also the Indonesia's largest trading partner and its second largest source of foreign investment. And the electric vehicles and the electric motorcycles from China have significant market potential in Indonesia. Also, for the solar energy and the geothermal power, these two areas also have immense potential for China-Indonesia cooperations. The Indonesian government is actively developing the solar power plants, floating solar PV projects, also other renewable initiatives. So I think that's why, which will provide the big opportunities for China to fill out this enthusiasm. Except the Indonesia, I think for the Vietnam, I think China will also have lots of interest to increase its effectiveness on the Vietnam. For example, in the first half of 2022, China completed cross-border electricity trade with Vietnam, Laos, and Myanmar through localized interconnected grids, totaling 1.43 billion kilowatts, with a year-on-year increase of almost 60%. Also, the construction of an interconnected power grid linking the Southeast Asia Peninsula, according to my knowledge, this plan has already been put on the agenda too. So I think China actually has a very big plans on those two countries. In addition, now I think, because another point I want to mention here is the US now, they have the Just Energy Transition Partnership in these two countries too. But from our talk with the think tanks and the scholars from Indonesia and Vietnam, they told us they think China's involvement in these two regions will be critical for the success of these two regions' low carbon transitions. Because as we know, the JETP actually now is not very successful. Because in these two countries, the demand for the electricity is increasing very fast. So the development of renewables in these two countries will not match the same amount increase in the electric. So that's why China's involvement will be very important, because China also is very efficient in those coal plants efficiency and stuff. So that's why I think in the short terms, it is impossible to phase out all coal plants in these two countries. So that's why for the next few years, I think both renewables and the previous like coal plants will coexist. So that's why at the same time, it is also very important for these two countries to improve their energy efficiency in coal power plants. So I think also in this direction, China can provide help. So that's why I think in the Southeast Asia, probably China and the US can work together on these directions. China can also provide the low-cost renewables combined with US technologies. So we can do something together with JETP to improve the transition path of the Southeast Asia countries. And the last point I want to mention in the China and probably with Europe will also intensify their cooperations on these regions too. Although previously China and the EU will focus on Africa, Central Asia, and Latin America. But I think because with the Trump re-elected, probably probably EU and China probably can also intensify their cooperations in Southeast Asia countries. Because in the COP29, I also talk about a lot with EU delegates. Because now most countries are expecting China and the EU can do more together for the next 4 years. Because as we know, in the first term of Trump administration, both EU and China work together a lot for the global climate governance. So in the second, Trump's 2.0, I think now many countries are looking forward to those two, EU and China, to work more together. So that's another possibility that China and the EU probably will intensify their cooperations in these regions. Okay, I'll stop here, and I'm looking forward to the panel discussion with Professor Angel and other professors. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Hu. You have given us a lot of food for thought. Just a quick summary on my personal takeaways based on what you have said. The first is that there are limits to subnational and non-state cooperation without national support between the two countries. And even if there are actors in the US and China who want to cooperate and engage, there are limitations due to the political climate, which is overshadowed by competition and distrust between the two sides. And then the third point in relation to Southeast Asia is that China is increasingly pivoting towards Southeast Asia, and there are a lot of opportunities there for the Chinese to explore with the Southeast Asian counterparts. And final point, I think what you've said is that there are actually opportunities for US and China to work together within the Southeast Asian space. I think even if both sides cannot cooperate directly, their actions can actually complement each other. So I will stop there. Thank you very much for your presentation. And now I will move on to the third speaker, Ms. Sharon Seah. Sharon, please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. I'm just going to pull out the slides. Please let me know if you can see the slides. Is this okay? Yeah? Okay. So thank you again, and thanks to Angel and Professor Hu for setting the stage on the US-China cooperation on climate matters. My presentation will be on ASEAN's climate trajectory after COP29 and in view of the impending Trump 2.0 administration. At a point when the world needs it most to address our biggest existential threat of our times, we're actually beginning to see the fragmenting of the global order, a fraying of the multilateral cooperation, greater protectionism, and rising nationalism. We expect in Southeast Asia that these trends will likely continue for the next decade. So these are very concerning times and very likely to impact the global climate discourse. And as Professor Hu had shared earlier, truly it is equal dissatisfaction and people walking away from the table finding that they haven't walked away with very much. I'm going to start with the perceptions from Southeast Asia, drawing from the Institute's Southeast Asia Climate Outlook Survey. This is a survey that we do every year, and we've done it for the last 5 years. In this year, we found rather interesting findings. The first is, let's start with the personal impact. When we ask respondents on a scale of 0 to 10, to what extent do they think that climate change impacts will negatively affect them? Actually, it's very high. There's been an increase in the percentage of persons at the rate of 55% in 2023 who feel that they will be negatively impacted to nearly 60% this year. And the country that is feeling the highest, greatest impact is the Philippines. So Southeast Asia can no longer, or Southeast Asian leaders can no longer say that climate change is not affecting their people when they are actually telling governments that they are feeling it at a personal level. And interestingly, also, when we ask respondents how they would rate their national government's policies and actions taken in support of climate change, you see there's actually an increase from 2021 to 2024 of the people who say that their government considers climate change a national priority and allocates sufficient resources. It actually increased threefold from 8.2% to 22.1%. Whereas those who say that the government is aware but not allocated sufficient resources has decreased to more than 10%. So it shows that governments have now shifted their positions from not considering climate change as a priority to now putting more resources to address them. But what is a little worrying is actually in this last chart, the last bar, is that the public is not aware of their government's views, much less about government policies about climate change. And this number doubled from 5.6% in 2021 to 11.3%. But what this means is actually that governments need to improve their communications with their own publics about plans and policies in place to address climate change. And this is the country breakdown where you see that Singapore and Vietnam respondents are most approving of their government's policies at over 50% and 36% respectively, whereas the Philippines is the most disapproving. Now, coming back to the global climate discourse, here we ask respondents who has demonstrated climate leadership in helping the world achieve Paris-aligned goals. And you can see a switch. In 2021, the EU ranked top, whereas in 2024, Japan came up tops. And really quite mistakenly, the Southeast Asian publics don't consider China to be a leader. And this we have found very strange because actually China has demonstrated quite a bit of leadership. Instead, the EU and Japan still continue to rank up there. And also interestingly, the US came up second in 2024, overtaking the EU at 20.4%. This could be due to the Biden effect and the fact that people in this region have been reading a lot about the IRA. On who is leading in global climate innovation, Japan continues to be the perceived leader. And I think last year when Angel joined us for a panel launch on the results, we also expressed puzzlement as to why the region continues to view Japan as the leader, when in fact China is actually the most innovative in terms of deploying clean energy technologies. And here this year we see that the US has surpassed China and EU to be second place, right? So this is quite peculiar. We also asked a question on which ASEAN country has the potential to be the region's climate leader. And this is the second time we asked this question. And the confidence in Singapore is actually quite high, has risen from 38.7% last year to 43.1% this year. And the second most positively viewed leader is actually Indonesia, followed by Thailand. We asked this question because we are thinking about, how the region can help itself. Now, I'm going to talk about the nationally determined contributions because Angel has also mentioned this earlier, and this is based on a study that we completed in 2023 and published in 2024. It's called Examining Climate Ambition Enhancement in ASEAN Countries, NDCs. And in this piece, we examine whether ASEAN member states have taken climate mainstreaming actions, strengthened or added sector policies, and whether scope of coverage has expanded. I won't go too much into the technical details of this piece because you can read it for yourself. It's an open access journal article. But as Angel briefly explained, right, when we signed the 2015 Paris Agreement, countries actually submitted what they call the intended NDCs. And then subsequently in 2020, 2021, they submitted what we call the NDC 2.0. They were given another opportunity to revisit and strengthen their NDCs at the end of 2022, but not many countries took up that opportunity. And now we're waiting for February 2025 when countries will submit their third round of NDCs. And from next year onwards, we are looking forward to a 5-year cycle where countries improve on their NDCs. Now, why is this important? Because in Article 4 of the Paris Agreement, each country is supposed to successively show a progression beyond their current NDCs. And for developing country parties, and that is Southeast Asia, most of us, we're supposed to move over time towards economy-wide emissions reduction. Okay. So far, all 10 ASEAN member states have submitted their NDC 1.0, 2.0, and only 3, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam, have submitted, revisited and strengthened their NDCs. So the remaining 6 have not. And as reported every year by the UN, there still is a significant emissions gap. Southeast Asia, of course, forms a small part of this gap, but still a gap nonetheless that they have to address. In our paper, we examine 4 ways in which countries can strengthen their NDCs, such as by strengthening economy-wide commitment, expanding the coverage of their commitments, strengthening sector-level commitment, including non-GHG targets, or adding and strengthening policies and actions. So our assessment of these NDC ambition enhancement was not intended to compare between ASEAN countries, which would be very difficult to do actually, because given the diversity in national circumstances and the formats in which they presented the NDC. So instead, we chose to use these ways to assess their enhancements. Okay. So in terms of how, from this chart, we can see that there has been progression in economy-wide GHG reductions for successive NDCs. I'm going to move very quickly because this is quite technical. And also in terms of GHG coverage ambition, we see that ASEAN member states have increased their ambition by expanding coverage modestly. So here, where they added new greenhouse gases, that's very positive. And if they removed, such as Vietnam, that's not viewed as positively. Okay. Sector coverage wise, we also see that Brunei, Cambodia, Laos and Myanmar, as well as the Philippines and Vietnam, have added different sectors, and that in general is viewed positively as well. And in terms of sectoral non-GHG targets, the bigger the circle and the bigger the numbers, it actually means that they've done better. So for instance, in the earlier slide, you can see that some countries have added new sectoral non-GHG targets. And in this other one, you see that Cambodia, interestingly, has really come up in terms of introducing new policies and actions. Okay. So in sum, based on our assessment, there are a few overarching trends in the region's climate ambition enhancement. On economy-wide targets, most ASEAN member states either did not increase ambition or increased it incrementally. However, there was a significant increase in sector and GHG coverage, which is a sign of stronger mainstreaming of climate change issues within different government sectors. Also within the region, we can see that ASEAN member states can be split into a few main NDC enhancement categories, right? So for category A, where coverage has been improved, we see countries like Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar doing that. For economy-wide targets, Brunei, Singapore, and Vietnam did better. And those with clearer sectoral strategies, Malaysia and Philippines, in fact, did better than most. And for countries that could do a little bit better with more communication, we see that as Indonesia and Thailand. Now, what does this all mean for ASEAN now that we've had COP29 and the second Trump administration coming in? When you see the headlines, it all sounds so doom and gloom, right? Trump 2.0 will hurt the planet, open the door for rivals. COP29 deemed as a failure. Stakes are high for the climate. And even China Daily reported that Trump 2.0 will threaten climate action. So what now? I think if you take an assessment, a balanced one, what we see is that the US cooperation with Southeast Asia actually predates and will certainly postdate Trump 2.0. Of course, it's a mixed bag of commitments. US climate cooperation with Southeast Asia or with ASEAN started in the early 2010s. And actually, it has remained fairly unambitious. And I foresee that this will remain the same way for the foreseeable future, or at least for the next 4 years. A mixed bag of commitments, because you see they've started programs like the USAID coming to the region in 2010. They joined ASEAN in its Smart Cities program in 2018. They have the JETP with Vietnam and Indonesia. And as you heard from Professor Hu, the JETP, and I confirm this in conversations that we've had with climate officials in the region, hasn't been going as well as it ought to. They also have a Japan-US Mekong Power Partnership in 2019. And when the Biden administration kickstarted the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework negotiations, they introduced a clean economy pillar. This was in 2022. And they also started a US-ASEAN electric vehicle initiative in 2023. And just this October at the summit, they announced a US-ASEAN Climate Solutions Hub. So a lot of initiatives, it seems, but there's no clear strategy or implementation plans. And a lot of it may be due to key ASEAN partners needing support. So for instance, the US ASEAN Smart Cities program was launched during Singapore's chairmanship in 2017. So perhaps at that time, the US was really keen at the subnational level to try to work with ASEAN, hence had joined it. And some cooperation like the IPEF will almost certainly peter out when Trump comes into office. So at this point, we expect that there'll be some level of institutional interest at the civil servant or bureaucratic levels for some of these commitments, like the JUMPP, the JETP, and so on, that may carry these initiatives through and hopefully survive the Trump 2.0 administration. I don't foresee that the administration will find great reasons to try to kill some of these initiatives. So in that sense, both sides will try to maintain a modicum of cooperation in climate among other areas. So therefore, I think my assessment is that the idea that Trump or the Trump administration can derail another region's climate plans is actually giving Trump too much credit. It's more likely that Trump's brand of transactionalism, his denialism of scientific evidence, the planned withdrawal again from the Paris Agreement may embolden other leaders to speak and act in ways that's disparaging towards the climate agenda as a whole. And in the decisions, of course, made by the US to pull out of financing. For instance, the kind of weakening commitments towards JETP may bear some implication for Southeast Asia. And moving to the COP, yes, disappointing outcomes. And in that sense, the climate finance agreements, I agree with Professor Hu, an agreement is better than no agreement, and an agreement at less than a third of what we had expected. Yes, small, but okay, let's take it as a start. What's happening is, of course, the butter will be spread thin on the bread, and it's very likely that it will impact mitigation targets of 7 out of 10 Southeast Asian countries. Because as you have seen earlier, many of the NDCs are actually conditioned on receiving assistance. And for example, the Philippines NDC is almost fully based on conditionality. It's about 75%, and only 2.71% is unconditional. So the inability to access finance assistance would mean they cannot meet their mitigation targets. Of the 10 ASEAN member states, only Brunei, Malaysia, and Singapore have committed fully to unconditional NDC targets. But these are small countries in terms of total quantum of emissions and the total mitigation targets. They are small. So I would say that the other 7 weaker and more vulnerable countries would require more assistance. But let's try to look at this from a more positive perspective. The silver lining, of course, is that without big assistance coming our way, is for ASEAN to now initiate a kind of regional climate self-help. So these kind of self-help mechanisms can kick in through creative blended finance mechanisms involving the private sector, for example. So at COP29, the Singapore government committed up to $500 million in concessional funding to support the Financing Asia's Transition Partnership, the FAST-P, and it's a dollar for dollar matching. And hopefully some of this pledging can come towards the Southeast Asian region. The last one is that the development of ASEAN's climate plans, in a way, the train has left the station, right? Because ASEAN has already started many of these plans more than 5, 6, 7 years ago. We now have an ASEAN carbon neutrality strategy endorsed in 2023. There's even an ASEAN taxonomy that guides business decisions, investment decisions coming into the region. It started in 2021, and now it's in its 3rd version. ASEAN is reviving talk of the ASEAN Power Grid, and that's to promote greater energy interconnectivity within the region. We have an ASEAN EV ecosystem, and they're now talking about an ASEAN common carbon framework, and that's kind of done in view of the idea of setting up a regional carbon trading mechanism. So in conclusion, the public sense of climate urgency is rising, as you've seen in that survey that I mentioned. Governments are perceived to be not doing enough, or really just not doing enough. International cooperation is weak, but there's some silver lining. So climate action momentum, I think in the foreseeable future, will have to be carried by governments in the region. And a last point, which I didn't add and I didn't have time to look into, also addressing Professor Hu's point about China filling that vacuum. I agree, because China is already the natural leader for Southeast Asia in many aspects of climate cooperation. If you look into the ASEAN-China cooperation, the plan of action on climate, it's very robust when you compare that to the US cooperation with ASEAN. Second one is that China is a leader in solar deployment, in solar technology. I just read in a report that China has actually cornered 80% of the battery market. So it makes sense for Southeast Asia to up our cooperation with China and to see where we can find common areas of cooperation. So with that, I would end this here, and we can take questions from here.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Just a quick summary based on my understanding of your presentation. About 5 points. First, the public plays a role in driving the climate agenda, and it is important to understand how they think in the region. Second, the Southeast Asian countries have submitted their NDCs, and there have been progress with these countries in their willingness to enhance their ambition, which is good. Third, with regards to US and Trump 2.0, in a way, ASEAN has its own climate agenda already set out, and it is going to survive Trump 2.0. Fourth, COP29, the point of concern is that because of the size of the funding, it may impact mitigation targets in 7 out of 10 Southeast Asian countries. And finally, with regards to China filling the vacuum, China is becoming an increasingly important actor in Southeast Asia's energy transition. And this is set to continue to follow. And this is where people should focus their attentions on. So thank you very much to all three speakers. Can I see all three speakers online with their videos on, please? So we've come to the Q&A section. I have one question from Ng Wai Moon, who is from Eco Business. So she is asking a question based on what Professor Hu Bin has said with regards to the JETP dynamics in Indonesia and Vietnam. And Professor Hu Bin mentioned that China seems to be playing a complementary role, although and is a critical player in this country's energy transitions. The question is, have any of you speakers seen a very active engagement by the Southeast Asian nations themselves in wanting the Chinese to play a larger leadership role? So we're talking about at the political level, whether there have been very active outreach towards the Chinese, or is it very much more on the business level where, you know, companies just come on their own accords and the development is organic? So this is a question to all three of you. I'm rephrasing the question that Wai Moon is asking. So are there any takers? No? Sharon, you're smiling, so
Yeah.
you go
Okay,
first.
so maybe I'll take a stab at this. I don't see an active outreach. Perhaps there are some at the bilateral level, but at least from the ASEAN perspective, I see it more as dialogue partners making their offerings, right? The offerings of climate cooperation, and ASEAN, basically ASEAN's DNA is to be open and inclusive. ASEAN will never say no to any kind of cooperation. So in that sense, when China comes with very well thought out, robust plans to engage, for instance, China has offered to engage in the ASEAN EV ecosystem. Makes complete sense, right? Because basically China is a leader in the EV ecosystem already, and ASEAN can then learn so much more from China. So, and it's not at the expense of rejecting anyone else. Because basically, if the US comes along with a solution, ASEAN is as willing to try out that solution as long as the other party is willing to play that game with us. So at the regional level, it's not active outreach by ASEAN, but I think when partnerships come along, they're happy to take that on. Yeah.
If I can just add, I mean, I'm thinking back to your point, Sharon, about the conditionality of Southeast Asian countries' NDCs and the necessity of financing. And of course, China also committed to several hundred millions and maybe even more than that to helping global South countries in their clean energy transitions. And so it'd be great to know if Professor Hu also observed these commitments also making waves amongst developing countries. And so, of course, China is not signing on directly to the Green Climate Fund or to these climate finance mechanisms that are predominantly aimed at developed countries, but they have been very active in South-to-South cooperation and providing climate financing to developing countries. So I think that might be one way where if the Southeast Asian countries require financing for the NDCs, maybe they would be a little bit more open to having Chinese support on the financing side. So I think that would be one thing to watch. And I'd be curious to hear Professor Hu's comments on the South-to-South announcements that were made on financing from China at COP29. And then the second piece I'm very curious to investigate as part of my time here at ISEAS is to understand whether or not there are Southeast Asian countries that are interested in adopting their own versions of the IRA or other forms of industrial policy to meet its decarbonization and climate goals. Because I would imagine if that there are Southeast Asian countries that are eager to establish their own clean energy manufacturing bases, then they would not be as positive or as welcoming for China to flood their domestic markets with these technologies. So there have been some grumblings in Thailand about Chinese automakers crowding out Thailand's own domestic manufacturing base for EVs and other autos in Thailand. But then again, you also have like other countries like Laos, which has been a huge beneficiary of Chinese investment through the Belt and Road Initiative, that have established or has actually announced plans and desires to become an EV battery manufacturing hub for Southeast Asia. And so I think this is something that would be really interesting for me to look into as part of my project here, is to understand whether or not we can see some elements of industrial policy being adopted, or at least discussed from Southeast Asian countries in areas where there could be potential competition from China, and whether or not those might be areas where the Chinese could support or I guess like try other means to try to influence or collaborate. But yeah, it'd be great to hear, Professor Hu, if you have any thoughts as well.
Okay, thank you for your comments. Actually, for this one, yes, because I had some cooperations with the Peking University professors to working on the JETP issues. So that's from what we heard, because we had several workshops with Indonesia and Vietnam scholars and government officials. So what they told us is they think the JETP now is not that successful. So they think the China's involvement will be very important for their future low carbon transitions. So that's the first point. Also, as you just mentioned, in the COP29, China announced it already invest like more than $100 billion in South-South cooperations. And also in the next few years, China will continue to increase the investments in those on the South and the South. Except those investments, they will also want to build like help those countries to improve their capacity buildings. Also, China pledged to, I think, have 15 satellites to help those countries for the extreme weather forecastings. Because China is always advocating the early warning systems for the developing countries. Also, China now have those capacities to do that. So also in the finance part, because yeah, that's the first time in COP29, China announced its real numbers. You know, previously China is reluctant because I think China is in the dilemma because he knows now it is the second largest economy, you must do something. So it has a lot of pressures. But at the same time, China always thinks it's a developing countries. They should have the same obligations as developed countries. So that's why they are reluctant to say, I can do more. Or I didn't do anything. So we need to have a balancing positions in these financial, situations. But I think China is willing to do more especially given the Trump re-elected, because as you just also, I want to answer your question, like the Trump will impose like 60% tariffs on China renewables. So that's why China is eager to, I think, enlarge its markets in other places like EU, like Southeast Asia. I think particularly in Southeast Asia, because it's very close to China. The cost is lower, right? If you want to have your export your goods to the neighbor countries, I think that's the easiest way to do that. So that's why China's focus will be in the neighbors first. So that's why I think China wants to have more influence in the Southeast Asia countries. Also now China, yes, I can really feel the change in China too, because now in Beijing, almost, I think now you can feel the same percent of the EV cars in Beijing street. Also for me, I also, when I have a second car, I will buy the EVs for sure. Also for the renewables, now for the electricity, the price is really low in some province. That's our findings. Actually, now it's even lower than the coal power plants than the previous from the coal. So I think that's this trend will likely to continue to be the same trend in the future. And so that's why in China, I think this is our cost will continue to lower for the renewables. So that's why not to use the cheaper products from China? I think we already have everything in place. So that's why I think China, for sure, will have more influence in the next 4 years at least. Yeah, that's my opinion. Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm moving to the next question is by Melinda Martinez, my colleague at ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute. It's a question to all three speakers. So with Trump's return to the White House, there are still US security alliances and geopolitical interests in the Indo-Pacific. And this is still likely to continue when we look at how the US engage the ASEAN region. Do you see US allies and partners such as the EU, Japan, Korea, Australia also contributing to the green transition in Southeast Asia? So what about the other actors, the other climate leaders trying to do their part in Southeast Asia? And then on the reverse, this is another question that Wai Moon from Eco Business asked earlier, which I didn't touch on. Also, same thing on the point of elections. With all this change of governments within Southeast Asia as well, with the recent elections, do you see a change in their approach in engaging the various climate leaders when they go out to look for investments? So do the new elected governments have new strategies in engaging the climate leaders when it comes to the energy transition? So who would like to go first? No? Any other key actors we should look out for when we talk about China's Southeast Asia's energy transition? Yeah, Sharon, you are muted.
Okay, on Melinda's question, I actually have doubts whether the alliance building and the mini laterals are going to go as strong as they did under the Biden administration, because Trump himself may have completely different views about building these alliances. Yes, they do, from administration to administration, they do expect that the partners in the Indo-Pacific begin to bear a greater burden of the security, bear a bigger share of the security burden. But it doesn't mean that Trump himself will actively be driving all of these alliances. I mean, bear in mind that during the Biden administration, the two chief architects, right, of the mini alliance building is Kurt Campbell, Jake Sullivan, and these folks are not going to be in government anymore. So it's quite unlikely that the kind of trilaterals, mini laterals that we've been seeing the last 4 years will continue to grow. Yes, they will still be sustained institutionally. I have no doubt about that, because the kind of like governance structure has already been built. So people just have to keep the wheels running. But will it grow anymore? I don't know. I have my personal doubts. And maybe it's good for Southeast Asia, for this kind of we'll take a hiatus on alliance building, so that Southeast Asia can then find its own feet, right, in thinking about the kind of security considerations that they need to put in place. On climate and energy transition, what we are seeing realistically is that I think that given that there are two theaters of conflict in the world now, one in Ukraine and the second one in the Middle East, I really doubt that partners like the EU will be as committed, to driving the climate transition here in Southeast Asia. They will maintain what they have committed to, but again, I don't think there's appetite to go into something new and more ambitious. Japan, I see Japan doing a lot more and trying to figure out its strategy in engaging with ASEAN member states on the energy transition and climate transition. These are the two partners. Australia as well, trying to up their game. But I don't see a kind of a coalescing of all of these. And of course, some people point to the fact that the Quad, for instance, has also got a climate change partnership going. But we'll see. I mean, we're in a stage of flux. So I think there's definitely room for different ASEAN dialogue partners to step into the vacuum, and not just looking at China as our biggest partner, but the others as well can come in to fill that space. The other question on elections, let's put it this way. I don't think any Southeast Asian government or party has actually campaigned on a green campaign or on making any climate promises. No sensible politician will, because it is a low boil issue and it's not likely to gain you those brownie points to get into office. So I really don't think that the kind of climate or leadership political transitions in Southeast Asia has a great bearing, because the economy preoccupies everyone more than climate issues, and you see that globally as well. I mean, many leaders chose not to go to COP. They went to G20 instead. And some of the pronouncements that were made came out of G20 and not at COP. So you can see the kind of reprioritization globally.
I actually have a question for you, Sharon. I mean, I'm wondering, based on your comments, how we can try to elevate the issue of the climate crisis on the political agenda in Southeast Asia. Is this something that you cover in the survey, or asking respondents to say what would make this a higher priority issue for you or for leaders in the region? Because I think that's a question we're struggling with in the United States as well. In this most recent election, it was appalling how little attention both candidates paid to the climate change issue. And at the same time, where I was living in North Carolina, in Western North Carolina, which is inland, it's not even close to the coast, was hit by a hurricane, and it devastated Western North Carolina. And the fact that it's still not a priority and on the political agenda of leaders as they campaign, I mean, I think that's a real crisis as well. So, I mean, I'm wondering if there are ways that we can try to bridge that gap here in Southeast Asia that might have broader lessons for other places around the world, including the United States, where it's still, as you said, a very low political issue.
You know, climate change is a problem that is everyone wants to solve, but no one will solve it, because everyone thinks that everyone else should be solving it, and not me. So that's the issue, and we have that problem here in Southeast Asia. So what you're trying to do is to try to connect the dots. Basically, no climate, no economy, right? If all you care about is economic growth, then by doing what you do now, you are destroying your economic opportunities in the future. And some of the advocates try to turn this around to say that, oh, there are opportunities in the green economy. I see a lot of that kind of discourse in Southeast Asia, which tries to attract the political leadership to think about how they can use the climate as an opportunity to tap into better livelihoods, more jobs, create the economic growth for the countries. But I don't know. I don't have an answer to that, Angel. I think this is a common problem that we all have to think about. And certainly the electorates have to make their preferences known to the leaders that they're voting in. Unfortunately, the electorate doesn't have a means to make their voices known, right?
And this is where I think China has it the best. You know, I think that they have the answers where it's just the leadership has made climate change a priority. And then as a result, everybody falls in line. So yeah, I think we should be following China's leadership in this example, because yeah, I don't know, Professor Hu, if you agree. We should all follow China's example.
In China wants to be a leader, but it's the same thing. But China also have its difficulties. As we know, the coal use increased in the past 3 years. Also, everybody say China probably will not peak, because due to the increase in the coal use. So that's also from the carbon peaking to carbon neutrality, we only have 30 years. I think that's why China is reluctant to be they want to be leader at the same time, but sometimes they are reluctant to be the leaders. So, there's still two different views. That's why I think also probably I can answer Professor Sharon's questions, why China's, in some countries, they not view China as a leader, because we have both. First, yes, we are the leaders in the renewables, but we also the largest emitters, and we also have a coal increase. So, that's a big challenge for China. Another point I want to add is probably Japan. I think probably that's another big players in the Southeast Asia countries, because in the COP29, actually, I talked with some business leaders from Japan, and they are very eager to work with China in the Southeast countries too, because Japan already invest a lot in those places. And with the new elected president, actually, he actually is willing to work with China in these areas, especially given the US probably will not do anything in the next 4 years. So I think Japan probably will be a next partners with China in those regions too. So like EU, so that's from my point of view, EU and also Japan probably will be the major partners in renewables in the next 4 years. Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Okay, so I have a few questions lined up, but they're all for Sharon. I think it's good to let her have a break. So I have I have a personal question for Angel and Bin as well. So assuming that the Trump 2.0 administration is not really keen to engage Southeast Asian countries in the context of climate agenda, do you think that they will try to disrupt China's efforts in engaging Southeast Asia? So they may not want to do something, but they may attempt to try to stall China's efforts in reaching out to Southeast Asia and to play a role as a climate leader. So, Professor Hu, maybe you can go first.
Okay, yeah. From my point of view, I think yes, for sure, they don't want China to be dominant in those regions because those regions also have a geopolitical, very important geopolitical status from the US side. So, for example, in the Vietnam, I think now the two countries are competing with each other, not just in renewables, but also in many other areas, economies, trade. But from China side, because as I just mentioned, because these countries are neighboring from China, I think China is more easier for China to access to these markets, especially given Trump's policies, because Trump's policy will more focus on itself. So also that these regions actually are far from US. So that's why I think that's the opportunity for China to, increase its effective, influence, improve their player status, in those countries. So that's from my point of view. Yes, they will try to block, but I think it's not easy to do that due to the Trump's policies focusing on American itself. But from China's side, we are eager to enlarge our markets, especially in our neighboring countries. So given this to offset, like not offsetting, this will help. This is how to say that, which is China is increased, the American decrease. So that's, which will make China is more important players in Southeast Asia countries. Thanks.
Angel, would you like to say something on this?
In the interest of time, no, I think Professor Hu articulated a very great response. So I'll just yield the time to you.
Okay, right now, according to my clock, it's already 4:29. So I think it's time to wrap up. Thank you very much to the speakers for sharing your views. I appreciate that. Thank you to the audience for tuning in as well. And thank you to my ISEAS colleagues who have been working behind the scenes. And this seminar will be posted on the ISEAS Yusof Ishak YouTube channel soon, so we can rewatch it there. My apologies to some of the audience with their questions. We are unable to answer all of them because of the time limitation, but feel free to reach out to the speakers directly. So on this note, we have come to the end of the seminar. Happy holidays and see you again. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.